All right. The rest of this podcast, I'm going to now focus on the truth about black history in this country. And I think this is extraordinarily important that we understand this. Our founding fathers in the Declaration of Independence established a really, really high ideal when they said the words, "All men are created equal." Back then, of course, the word men meant both men and women. Okay? All men and women are created equal. Now, obviously, there are biological differences between men and women, but my purpose isn't to get into those differences. That is a very, very high and lofty ideal, and quite honestly, our country has made significant progress in terms of drawing closer and closer to achieving that lofty ideal. And I believe that we will continue to make progress if we are allowed. There is, however, an effort underway that you're probably aware of. It's called the Project 1619, or the 1619 Project, that is steeped in critical race theory. Critical race theory, basically, in its most simplest terms, it leverages the concept taken from Marxism of the oppressed and the oppressor. Critical race theory suggests that blacks in this country have been the oppressed and that whites have been the oppressors. Now, I'm oversimplifying, obviously, but that's essentially what the critical race theory talks about. And, as I said, the 1619 Project is steeped in critical race theory. 1619 Project was established by, I believe it was the New York Times, not too long ago. And increasingly, we're going to be finding that this 1619 Project material will be showing up in classrooms all around this country, and it won't take long. There is another book, as I have shared in a previous episode of this podcast, called A People's History of the United States of America, written by Howard Zinn. This book is, if you read this book, it is also steeped in critical race theory. It starts from the beginning and goes to the end, and basically highlights everything that has happened in this country from a race perspective. It virtually doesn't identify much good that has ever happened in this country. It skips all of that in our history, and it just focuses on the issue of race and how race has been at the foundation, at the core of everything that is horrible and unacceptable in this country. In fact, today there are calls or suggestions that there is systemic racism. I don't believe that. In fact, I do believe that earlier in the history of the United States there was systemic racism. In other words, there were actual laws on the books that prevented, that allowed segregation, and that prevented blacks from being treated as equal with whites. That all ended with the Civil Rights Movement in the 1950s, 1960s with Martin Luther King Jr. Another huge step forward in the history of this country. I don't believe that systemic racism exists. If it does exist, it's illegal. If there are laws in place that are systemic, they are completely contrary to the Civil Rights Act, and therefore illegal, unconstitutional, and frankly, I don't believe that they exist. Does that mean that every person's heart in the country, in this country, in the United States of America, is as open and respectful and kind as it should be? No, I don't believe so. Those are, however, changes that cannot be made by law. Those are changes that can only be made from the inside out with the help from God above. And that's my strong and personal feeling. All right. Along these lines of systemic racism, 1619 Project, we're also starting to hear words like equity instead of equality. The Declaration of Independence talked about all men are created equal, but it didn't say that there should be equity in terms of outcomes, that every outcome should be equal. That's not what our founding fathers believed. However, terminology is now changing, and increasingly in President Biden's administration, the word equity is now being used. In fact, Susan Rice, a member of his cabinet, and a former member of President Obama's cabinet, said the following recently in a public address. She said, "Every agency, meaning every federal government agency, will place equity at the core of their public engagement to redress systemic racism where it exists." Equity, as I said, means equality of outcomes. All I can say is, if they desire to achieve true equity, where every outcome is based proportionally on the makeup of the population of this country, well then LeBron James better watch out, because the NBA, which is made up principally of black people, and they are phenomenal athletes, well, that's all going to have to change, isn't it? Because it's going to have to be a certain percentage white, a certain percentage black, a certain percentage Hispanic, so on and so forth, if equity is to be achieved, as President Biden is now talking about. Okay, so that is where, that seems to be where President Biden's administration is going on the subject of racism, equity versus equality, and so forth. The reason that I bring that up is because the narrative is changing. Our history is being whitewashed, and so much of the good that has happened in our country since its founding, those 230 years ago, is being eliminated from our history. And that's completely unacceptable in my personal opinion, and I know that you feel much the same way. But it's happening. It's happening right before our very eyes. This book is, as I mentioned, so much of this book has eliminated so much of the history of our country, and so much of the narrative that we are hearing today with regard to race is all about this oppressed and the oppressor narrative. And it hasn't always been that way. In fact, what I'd like to do, and what I'm going to share with you right now is kind of a surprise. I had a meeting this week with a gentleman by the name of David Barton. He is the founder and president of an organization called Wall Builders out of Texas. That organization has been around for many years. He's married, he has 3 grown children, and David is quite a historian, one of the foremost historians in terms of U.S. history. He has a collection of over 100,000 documents that are originals that date back to before 1812. His specialty is Founding Fathers, Constitution, early U.S. history. All of these, as I said, are either original documents or certified copies of letters, sermons, newspaper articles, and official documents of the Founding Fathers. I had a meeting with him during this last week talking about my vision to improve civics and U.S. history education here in the state of Utah. And I was just kind of picking his brain in terms of some specific ideas or recommendations that he might have. And he had some good ones. At the end of that conversation, I asked if he would join this podcast sometime during the month of February, since February is Black History Month, and talk specifically about the true history of blacks in this nation. I'm going to actually be sharing in this episode a document that his organization has created that touches on some of the information that he may cover, but he's going to be speaking to it just right from the heart. And what I would like to do during the rest of this episode is read through a document that his organization has created that outlines and clarifies the history of blacks in this nation and some of the amazing accomplishments that they have made in helping this nation become what it is today, from the earliest days of our founding until now. David Barton, as I mentioned, has this massive library of these documents. In 2005, he was selected in Time magazine as one of the 25 most influential evangelicals. He's also a pastor in Texas. He has served as the former vice chair of the Texas Republican Party, and he is often praised by nationally recognized conservatives. I am thrilled and excited to be able to have him join Restoring Liberty sometime in the next 2 or 3 weeks. So stay tuned and keep watching. He will be here shortly. All right? So as I said, what I'd like to do now is refer to a document that his organization has created. And it's titled Important Facts About Race and America, Not Covered by the 1619 Project or Critical Race Theory. Now you're understanding why I gave you some background about the 1619 Project and Critical Race Theory. If you know anything about those two, the project or the theory, you're going to find that some of this factual information that I share with you right now is completely contrary to some of the stuff that you may have been actually taught. All of the quotes, all of the claims that are made in this document are footnoted in this document. I believe you can probably find the document on his website, wallbuilders.com. If not, go ahead and text me, email me, and I'll figure out a way to get you a copy of this document. Let's go ahead and begin. This document begins with the following words: schools, regardless of which curriculum they choose to use, should present an accurate view of the history of race and racism in America. I agree with that. It's not all rosy, but it's also not as bad as this book says that it is. The modern narrative now routinely ignores or excludes numerous important historical facts that should be taught, that must be taught, including the following. All right, here we go. Slavery and racism have affected all nations and is not limited solely or even primarily to America. True statement. And quite frankly, as you will see as we go through this document, America, because of the lofty ideals established by our founding fathers, I would say, in the Declaration of Independence, where they said that all men are created equal, because of those lofty ideals, our country has made greater progress faster than virtually any country in the world. Next bullet point. Prior to the arrival of any European in America, from 20 to 40% of indigenous people were enslaved by other natives, placing them on par with the slave empires of ancient Rome and Greece. So slavery wasn't introduced to America, is basically what he's saying, by the Europeans that came. It was already here, and it was being practiced by the indigenous people living on this land. Next bullet point. During the transatlantic slave trade from 1501 to 1875, pay attention to these numbers, 12.7 million Africans were involuntarily enslaved and forcibly carried from Africa by other nations across the globe. 12.7 million. Of these, 46%, or approximately 5.8 million, were made slaves in Portuguese holdings. So that's the biggest number right there. 26% in English holdings, or 3.3 million. 11% in French holdings. 8% in Spanish holdings, or 1.1 million. 4% in Dutch holdings, 0.6 million. And only 2.4% of the enslaved Africans, or 0.3 million, 300,000, were brought to the United States. By world comparison, America was one of the lesser receiving nations for slaves. I think that's important. This book and so many other documents make it sound like we are the most oppressive country in the world, that slavery has been in this country the biggest issue than any other country in the world, and that's not true. Next bullet point. The first African American slaves arrived in Virginia in 1619. That's why it's, by the way, called the 1619 Project. But, and this is what the 1619 Project won't tell you. Let me read this again. The first African American slaves arrived in Virginia in 1619, but became indentured servants instead of slaves, earning their freedom, with the state giving them their own land after a set number of years. The 1619 Project, by the way, the contention of that project is that the arrival of the first slaves was in 1619, and ever since 1619 it's just been all slavery. Been all oppression. And even those first individuals that arrived were not slaves. They were indentured servants, and they earned their freedom, and they even received their own land after a certain number of years. Next bullet point. The second documented slave ship didn't arrive until 1646 in New England, specifically Massachusetts, whereupon the slaves were freed and the slave owners imprisoned, being charged with the crime of man-stealing. Is that ever mentioned in the 1619 Project? Is it ever mentioned in this document right here? The first documented occasion of legalized black chattel slavery in America did not occur until 1651 in Virginia, when free African American Anthony Johnson sued in court and won the right to own another African American for life. So, the first slave owner was an African American. Is that mentioned in our history? No, I don't think so. Next bullet point. Because early slave laws in America allowed the ownership of whites, in addition to black and Indian slaves, whites were also enslaved in the United States. Globally, up to the 16th century, there were more documented white slaves in the Old World than black slaves in the New World. And from the 16th through the 18th centuries, Muslims took some 1.25 million white slaves. Their emphasis was more on enslaving non-Muslims than any particular race, but thousands of white American Christians were seized from American ships in the Mediterranean and made slaves in Africa. Next bullet point. While African Americans were elected to state office in America as early as 1641, so the first African Americans were elected to state office in America in 1641 in Maryland specifically, and dozens were elected to local, state, and federal positions in the late 1800s. It was not until 1987 that a black person was elected to Parliament in Great Britain, 2010 in Russia, and so forth in many other nations that are still decades or centuries behind the progress made in America. I hope you're listening to this. The narrative that says that America has been the place that has been so oppressive and has acted so evil, in such an evil way against the black people. And don't get me wrong, there are bad things that have happened in this country. There have been. But America has taken the lead time and time again. And that's just one other example. Next bullet point. In New England in the 1700s, noted black Americans were elected to office in majority white regions. In other words, blacks ruled over whites. I shouldn't say rule, because that makes it sound like we had some kind of a monarchy going on here. Including Wentworth Cheswill in New Hampshire, Thomas Hercules in Pennsylvania, and others. And black Americans also served as pastors of white congregations, such as Lemuel Haynes did in Massachusetts, New York, and Vermont. There was this commonality, this sharing, this back and forth that existed my friends, in the early days of the United States and in this great land of ours, where at times blacks led and other times whites led. That isn't told any longer in our history. One of the first casualties of the movement, next bullet point, one of the first casualties of the movement for American independence was a black patriot whose name was Crispus Attucks, who was shot by British soldiers during the Boston Massacre. In other words, blacks were fighting for American independence. We know that. That's one of those things that has remained in our U.S. history, fortunately. But it is being downplayed. Next bullet point. At the Battle of Lexington, the battle of the first battle of the Revolutionary War, American militiamen who confronted the British soldiers were an integrated unit which came out of the church pastored by Jonas Clark. Americans wounded in that battle included black patriots such as Prince Estabrook and white patriots such as John Robbins, who all went to church together. Next bullet point. In the original draft of the Declaration of Independence, the longest grievance was the anti-slavery clause penned by Thomas Jefferson, which failed to make it into the final document after only 2 of the 13 states rejected it. And that was because the rules for the Declaration of Independence, that body that gathered to draft that document, required unanimous approval for each of the grievances that needed to be listed in that document. Only 2 of the states rejected it. 11 of the 13 states accepted Thomas Jefferson's proposal that called out slavery as being evil and unacceptable for this country. Bottom line, basically what that bullet point is saying is slavery and a love for slavery was not pervasive here in the United States of America when the Declaration of Independence was signed. During the American War for Independence, the Revolutionary War, the next bullet point, the military was integrated and African Americans routinely re-enlisted, voluntarily serving an average of 9 times longer than white soldiers, voluntarily. Next bullet point. Some of the decorated soldiers in Washington's army were black heroes such as Salem Poor, Prince Whipple, Jack Prince Sison, Peter Salem, Lemuel Haynes, James Armistead, Richard Allen, Jordan Freeman, those in the first Rhode Island, Oliver Cromwell, Brister Baker, and many more. They were decorated soldiers in Washington's army, black heroes of the Revolutionary War. Next bullet point. New England was the first major region in the modern world to abolish slavery. New England was the first major region in the modern world to abolish slavery. Where is New England located? Within the boundaries of the United States of America. America took the lead in terms of abolishing slavery. Pennsylvania and Massachusetts began doing so in 1780. Connecticut and Rhode Island in 1784, New Hampshire in 1792, Vermont in 1793, New York in 1799, and New Jersey in 1804. Tremendous leadership in terms of striving for that ideal, that lofty ideal of all men are created equal and that slavery is contrary to that ideal, right? Let me continue in this bullet point. Some granted immediate freedom and some gradual emancipation, but slavery was either ended or officially put on the path to extinction in those states long before any nation in the world had done so, and nearly 30 years before Great Britain, which was credited as the first nation to abolish slavery. We did it before Great Britain. Next bullet point. Early leaders such as John Adams and Francis Scott Key regularly went to court to advocate for the rights and liberties of slaves, successfully arguing for their freedom. Founding Father John Hancock hosted equality gatherings of black and white citizens in Massachusetts in the 1790s. In fact, Among the group called Founding Fathers, of those with a recorded position on the subject, over 2/3 opposed slavery, freed slaves, or belonged to or led anti-slavery societies. Does that story, by the way, come out in the narrative that's being taught to our kids in our schools today? No, I don't think so. Not much of what I'm reading here is coming out today. There has been such an incredible whitewashing of the history of this country, and the amazing and incredible contributions of blacks and progress that has been made in this country with regard to race. All right, let me take a quick drink. Next bullet point. At the time of the ratification of the U.S. Constitution, black Americans held citizenship in several states, including Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New York, New Jersey, and North Carolina. Black Americans could vote in 10 states during the Revolutionary era, and after the ratification of the Constitution, states such as Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and New York. So in a number of the states, blacks could already vote and held citizenship. Next bullet point. America was the first nation in the world to sign a law banning the slave trade, and that occurred in 1807. Next bullet point. Beginning in 1819, America dispatched and maintained a U.S. naval squadron off the coast of Africa to prevent other nations from taking slaves out of Africa. Not only did we cease to import them, at least into the majority of the United States, we also placed our own forces there to cease allowing other countries from taking slaves out of Africa. That squadron intercepted and turned back numerous ships from other countries, continuing its efforts until the outbreak of the Civil War, when that squadron was called home to fight the Southern Slaveholding Confederacy. Next bullet point. Slavery was practiced by many races in America. In fact, in the 1830 U.S. Census, 43% of free black households in South Carolina owned black slaves, as did 40% of free black households in Louisiana, 26% in Mississippi, 25% in Alabama, and 20% in Georgia. And blacks owned slaves in the North, as well as in the South. This isn't about blacks. This is about slavery, isn't it? And in fact, if you read the clause in the Constitution that talks about proportional representation and the 3/5 rule, that isn't about blacks. That's about slavery, which is a blight, which was a blight in the early days of this history, of the history of our country. But as I'm demonstrating here pretty convincingly, it was not pervasive. It was limited only to a certain number of states in this country, and this country took the lead in terms of abolishing it. All right, very good. Next bullet point. In the census of 1860, in the Choctaw, Cherokee, Creek, and Chickasaw tribes, 1 out of every 8 persons, or 12%, was an African American slave. A higher percentage of slave ownership than that of white Americans. In other words, Native Americans, even as late as 1860, were still slave owners. And because Indian tribes are considered separate and independent nations under American Constitution law, when the 13th Amendment abolished slavery in 1865, it had no effect on Indian tribes. Slavery in those tribes continued and was finally ended when subsequent treaties were negotiated with the federal government. Thus, indigenous American natives were both the first and last group to practice slavery in America. Next bullet point. Numerically speaking, most American slaves were owned by whites, but the overwhelming majority of American whites never owned a slave. Let me repeat that. Numerically speaking, most American slaves were owned by whites, but the overwhelming majority of American whites never owned a slave. According to the 1860 census at the beginning of the Civil War, not even 8% of American families owned slaves. And that number included white, black, Native American, and other slave owners, not just whites. Was the problem pervasive? No. Did it exist? Yes. But we abolished it. Next bullet point, America is the only nation in the world where whites, on behalf of enslaved black people, went to war against other whites in order to end slavery, resulting in the loss of well over 500,000 white lives. I think that bullet point is powerful. And that's just the first part of the bullet point. Let me read that again. America is the only nation in the world where whites, on behalf of enslaved black people, went to war against other whites in order to end slavery, resulting in the loss of well over 500,000 white lives. Following the Civil War, when the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were added to the Constitution to secure civil rights and voting rights for black Americans, whites were the vast majority of legal voters, and they voted in favor of it. Significantly, 2/3 of the whites in Congress, and then a majority of whites in 3/4 of the states, voted to ratify those amendments, thus voluntarily limiting their own political power in order to extend equal rights to black Americans. I think that paragraph is powerful. Next bullet point. With its final abolition of slavery in 1865, America became one of the earliest nations in the world to completely end slavery. Indeed, from a global perspective, America started first, gave the most, and made the greatest sacrifices in abolishing slavery. I ask you, is that point made in this book anywhere? No. Is that point made anywhere in the 1619 Project? No. There is no recognition of the amazing progress made in this country under the leadership, originally, of the whites. White people voluntarily fighting against slavery and giving their lives to abolish that practice. Nowhere is that spoken of openly and effectively. 3 more bullet points. Of the 193 nations in the world today, and this document was created last year, 2020, 94 of them still have not criminalized slavery. 94 still have not criminalized slavery. America was one of, if not the earliest. We have given leadership to this issue as we have given leadership to many other moral issues in the past, and there are still countries around the world that have not criminalized slavery. Next bullet point. Today, there are currently 40 million slaves in the world, 3 times more than in the entire 4-century history of the transatlantic African slave trade. It's still an issue, but not here. Final bullet point. Today, America is ranked by the Global Slavery Index as second most active, best nation in the world in fighting slavery. And it's not just blacks. We also have the sex trade. It's just a horrible, horrible practice that exists in this country and around the world. And we've got to keep fighting that slavery issue as well, quite honestly. All right, very good. Well, my friends, that's the end of this episode. I'm going to divide this episode in 2 parts, both audio and video. Just because this was a fairly long episode, don't feel like you have to watch both of them all in one sitting. Divide it up, but I hope you enjoy. I hope you continue to learn. One of my objectives with this podcast is to make sure that there is not much fluff, but that there is a lot of substance, and that you'll learn a ton of stuff that is important and significant and relevant to the world that we live in today. And I hope the kind of things that you're learning are allowing you to become not only more informed, but appreciate better the kind of actions that you need to take in order to help preserve the liberties of our nation. God bless you, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.